Interesting. I love this, you know, going on the theme. We've been out west, we've been to the Atlantic, we've been to Manitoba, and now we're so happy to welcome Sarah Vandenhoven and Kirsten Jacobson from Health Canada. Sarah's a senior science advisor in the existing Substances Risk Assessment Bureau. The Bureau is responsible for human health risk assessment of chemicals, currently in commerce in Canada under the Government of Canada's, do you mind finding the thing? And Kirsten manages the Chemical Hazards Evaluation and Management Division of the Workplace Hazardous Materials Bureau. Bureau is responsible for administering the Hazardous Products Act, which sets out the requirements for suppliers to communicate the hazards associated with their products in the form of safety data sheets and product labels. The Chem Division conducts hazard assessments in order to classify chemicals in more than 20 different health and physical hazard categories, example carcinogenicity. Over the past year, Kirsten and Sarah have been co-leading the development of a forward-thinking strategy to better protect Canadian workers under the Chemicals Management Plan. So welcome both of you.
Thank you so much for having us, for inviting us to come here, and for being so flexible with our terrible airplane schedules. I appreciate it. So I'll jump right in, and I'll do the first half of the deck, and then Kirsten, I think, will come up for the second part of the presentation. Basically today, this is an outline of what we thought we would present to you on. I wasn't sure if everyone in this audience would be familiar with the Chemicals Management Plan, so I was going to give a bit of a background there. We haven't typically had much of a role in the area of occupational exposure, so I thought it might be good to give a bit of a 101. We've also been doing some opportunities analysis in the area of occupational exposure with the provinces and territories and our stakeholders, and so we wanted to present the results of that opportunities analysis to you, as well as an overview of the consultation document that sort of came out of that. Then present on what we heard from that public consultation and some next steps. Maybe just to flag here too that this is everything I'm presenting is very early thinking, and we really are looking forward to hearing, feedback and thoughts from the audience. So, if you have questions, we're open to hearing them towards the end, and any feedback would be very welcome. So this is sort of an illustration of the different acts that are involved in the Chemicals Management Plan. It was launched back in 2006 and introduced sort of a more collaborative approach between these different chemicals management acts in the federal government. So I work in the area of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA. And under CEPA, we work with Environment and Climate Change Canada to assess the risks of chemical exposures to the environment and to human health. And when we look at human health, we're looking at exposure to the general population. So we haven't been looking at occupational exposures. When a risk is identified through an assessment under CEPA, then we'll look to see if CEPA is the best place act to manage those risks, or if, for example, doing something under the Pest Control Products Act or the Food and Drugs Act is more appropriate. So that's sort of how we all work together. This is my CMP 101 or CEPA cycle slide as a bit of a background. And I thought I could use an example sort of to illustrate the different steps that we have in this cycle. And I think this will help give a bit of a background to the slides that come up, because a lot of the activities that were proposed in the consultation document and that will be described later are expansions to these activities that we're already doing just from a general population lens. So if we start at the top with prioritization, back at the launch of the CMP back in 2006, we just finished prioritizing the whole inventory of chemicals that were in commerce. So like 23,000 chemicals on our domestic substances list, and we identified 4,300 priorities for assessment. So in this example, with the ketones, 10 ketones were identified for further assessment. Since that time, we've developed a prioritization process that's ongoing and more cyclical, so we're not just basing everything on one point in time back in 2006. In order to do our risk assessments, we need information on both the hazard and exposure. So we have information gathering, and often as part of information gathering, we'll survey industry. we'll do a mandatory survey to industry to get a sense of what the current commercial status is of a chemical. So we'll ask them questions like, how much of this chemical is manufactured, imported, or used? What are the uses for that chemical? Is it intended for products used by children? Things like that. So that will help inform the assessment. So in the case of ketones, we did that survey in 2001 and 2012. Another source of exposure information is research and monitoring information. So at Health Canada, we have a research and monitoring program. They'll often have information on the chemicals that we're assessing that will inform the exposure assessment. So in the case of ketones, we had data from the Canadian Health Measures Survey and the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program. So together, this exposure data will help inform our assessment. So for the ketones, we found out that it's primarily used as solvents in various products, including products available to consumers like paints, coatings, and adhesives. So taking that exposure information, we would drive scenarios, compare it to the hazard, and characterize the risk. So in the case of ketones, looking at the general population, there was a potential risk identified. For the ketones, we currently have a draft that is published online, so it goes out for public comment. Public comments are then received and considered, and a final assessment is published later on. And so in this case, there was a concern identified in the risk assessment, so at the same time, a risk management scope will be published that outlines potential risk management actions that could be taken. And so this gets published with the draft, again, for public comment. And so in the case of ketones, it was proposed to add to Schedule 1 of SEPA, and considering the development of regulatory or non-regulatory measures to protect, to reduce exposure of certain products that are available to consumers, because it's the consumers that we're looking at in our assessments. And then, so I guess we're in the process of finalizing that risk assessment, that risk management document. And then in the middle here, we have this communication and stakeholder engagement that happens throughout the process. Like I mentioned, everything's available online, and there's links in this deck if you're interested in seeing more. So I guess in the context of modernizing the chemicals management plan and looking at activities where we could expand, occupational exposure has been identified as one area that we've heard from our stakeholders over the years. We've received a lot of comments that our assessments should be looking at occupational exposure. So we recognized early on that this is an area where other groups in Health Canada, like Kirsten's group, has a lot of experience with the Hazardous Products Act and the federal, provincial, territorial occupational health and safety regulators. So as a first step, we started working with them to see, what are the opportunities here for an expanded role for Health Canada. So we started working with them and doing an opportunities analysis. About, I think, 2 years ago, so January 2018, we set up a small working group with a couple of representatives from the provinces, from BC and Alberta, and we wanted to get sort of a lay of the land, understand the landscape of what was happening in all the different jurisdictions in Canada, so that we could identify opportunities for an additional role for Health Canada. So with this working group, we set up a survey that was done in each jurisdiction to understand that landscape. And from that survey, we heard that there was interest from the provinces and territories in working more collaboratively with Health Canada, and that this could help advance a more proactive approach to their program delivery. So that was a good first step. We thought we would organize a face-to-face meeting to explore that further. Discuss, what potential options or activities could be, and that is ultimately what fed into this consultation document that was posted online over the summer. Going into this, we knew that there would be a lot of lessons learned to glean from other countries throughout Canada, and potential opportunities to collaborate. In the CMP, we work very closely with the US EPA, with the Australian Chemicals Management Agency, NICNAS, and the Europeans, all of which consider occupational exposure in their assessments. So there was lots to learn from them. And then, of course, there's occupational health and safety agencies in all of those countries, too, that have a role. And lessons can be learned. So as part of this opportunities analysis, we've been reaching out to various agencies to have conversations and learn what we can as we explore a potential future role for Health Canada here. We also realized early on that there were some guiding principles or some key things that kept coming up in our discussions, and so we thought we would get them down as guiding principles for our work here. We want to make sure we're continuing to make decisions based on sound science. We want to make sure that any regulatory decisions should be backed up by targeted and robust compliance verification and enforcement, and so that particularly applies in the case of Kirsten's program and the Hazardous Products Act. We recognize the importance of supporting all stakeholders and understanding the hazards and risks of exposures to chemicals in the workplace. And we want to make sure we're avoiding duplication. And so that's why we're working so closely with the provinces and territories to make sure anything that's on the table would not be duplicating what they're already doing and really supporting and enhancing what's happening in Canada. So coming out of the opportunities analysis, these are the activities that we identified as being potentially valuable activities for Health Canada to explore. And so the next slides speak a bit to each of these different activities. And the link to the consultation documents provided on this slide. The public comment period's closed, but the link is still live. One idea that came up in our discussions with, sort of how we could go about doing each of these activities was the idea of having a committee, because we recognize that collaboration with the provinces and stakeholders was critical to any of these activities. So we put forward this idea of a Health Canada FPTOSH Regulator Committee. This is discussed in the consultation document. And there are various roles that this committee could play, but it's just, I think, to recognize that a lot of the information, for example, that would identify priorities in the workplace would come from those working in the field. So we thought it would make sense to have this committee to share information, identify priorities, and work together on these different activities that are outlined more in the document. And certainly we're starting to explore expanding existing committees that are already in place, rather than starting from scratch and starting a new committee, because there are venues where we're already working with our stakeholders or the provinces and territories that could potentially be expanded. So in terms of the first sort of activity that's outlined in that document is prioritization. Like I just said, we would want to work with stakeholders and FPTs to identify priorities. We have a prioritization process already in place under the CMP. It just doesn't looking at potential risks in the workplace. So that's a potential area that could be expanded. And it would really be the outcomes of prioritization that would be different than what we have now. So we could look at identifying priorities for classification, for hazard classification or risk assessment, occupational exposure limit development, or research and monitoring. And really, those are all the activities that I'll be discussing in the next slide. So prioritization is sort of the first step to all of those. We heard through our survey and our face-to-face meeting with the provinces and territories that there was interest in having an additional source of occupational exposure limits that could be considered by the provinces and territories in each of their jurisdictions. And so when we heard this, we thought we kind of have a model like this at Health Canada now with the drinking water quality guidelines, where Health Canada works with the provinces and territories to identify priorities for guideline development. Health Canada does that evaluation, and the provinces and territories review and approve it, and then use that guideline as they like, as it's appropriate in their jurisdictions. So the consultation document sort of proposes following this model, or like expanding on this model to work in the case of occupational exposure limits too. And the good data is key to all activities described in this proposal. So I think research and monitoring fits well here too. I mentioned that Health Canada has a research and monitoring program that informs our assessments and performance measurement of the program. So while right now we don't have a really targeted research and monitoring program related to exposures to chemicals in the workplace, There have sort of been like ad hoc projects that Health Canada researchers have led. They're listed here for your reference. I think even our colleague Pat Rasmussen was here presenting 2 years ago on the detection of carbon nanotubes in indoor workplaces. So there is experience to build on, and there are existing biomonitoring initiatives even that are collecting information on occupation that just sort of haven't been analyzed from that angle to see, what the chemical exposure levels are compared to occupation. So examples of that would be MyRec and CHMS. And then in terms of risk assessment and risk management, I mentioned how under SEPA we're not looking at occupational exposures in our risk assessments, but our international counterparts are. But I'll just also mention that those international regulators are often finding that it's the occupational exposure that's driving the risk management from those risk assessments. So we've certainly heard over the years that what we should be doing should be more similar to what's happening with our international counterparts. And they're finding even that, in some cases, even with PPE and with controls in place, there's still a risk identified. And the next slide has an example of that. Another nuance that I'll just highlight is that we have a pre-market assessment program too. So that initial SEPA cycle that I showed was more about chemicals that are already in commerce in Canada, the existing substances program, but there's also a new substances program that has companies notify when a chemical is going to be imported or manufactured into Canada, and Health Canada does an assessment of those chemicals, and we would consider also expanding that part to include occupational exposure too. So this is just an example of a chemical that was assessed both under the CMP, looking only at general population exposures, and it was also assessed in the US by the EPA. It's NMP, and so in the US, they'll look at occupational exposures. And I won't go into the details because I think we're short on time, and the links, I think the link is here to the assessment, but it lays out all the different scenarios that are considered, like in the US assessment, looking at acute exposures, chronic exposures, when they use different PPE, inhalation, dermal, and it really presents different scenarios and where there's a risk and where there's not a risk. So, if we were in the CMP to expand to do occupational exposure, we could do something similar and share that with the provinces and territories and stakeholders to show where we found potential risks, where there aren't, so that risk management can be taken. And I think that's it for the sort of CMP part. I'll let you go, Kirsten.
Hi, I'm going to talk to you, expand on that, but sort of go more now into the sort of more traditional WHMIS-linked activities. I think the first thing is that the CMP has been successful in large part due to the collaborative approach, using a best placed act approach, and if we were ever going to roll occupational exposures into that, we'd need to expand that to include the programs responsible. And for those of you who may not be familiar, at the federal level, there is the Hazardous Products Act and its regulations. This set out the core requirements, including all the requirements for labeling product, all of the classifications for safety data sheets, both physical and health hazards. And Health Canada also administers sort of a parallel legislation that allows suppliers and employers to file a claim for exemption from disclosing their information that they consider to be confidential business information while still meeting the hazard disclosure requirements in the Act. And obviously the provincial, territorial, as well as federal, for us federal employees, administer the employer arm of that, as well as training and education. So if we were ever going to roll in the protection of workers under the Chemicals Management Plan, this would need to be, and is sort of obviously a consideration. So there's three real main activities that we are including as potential improvements, ways that we could accomplish that under this proposal. The first one is sort of improving how we do science. Sarah already mentioned that data gaps are an issue. So we need to be able to collect the data. This is one area of collaboration where we can use that approach, as well as all of our stakeholder committees, to gather data so that when we do classifications and when we look at chemicals, we're looking at the chemicals that are most relevant in workplaces, most relevant to workers. The next piece is, of course, continuing to leverage all of the different relationships that we have to do that in the best way. And this is really where all that data is going to come from. The next piece is sort of obvious, but we have been classifying chemicals for nearly 30 years, but primarily only telling the people who we are, the individuals who are applying for a claim for exemption, for example, about those classification decisions. So an obvious step is to start to put some of that information out in the public domain to make it easier for suppliers and employers to come up with accurate classifications that agree with each other and that make sense. The other piece is we know that WHMIS has been around for a long time, but WHMIS 2015 is still relatively new and it's quite complex, and we can focus our efforts on compliance promotion areas where we know that suppliers and employers may be struggling. And the third piece is sort of the natural final piece of that. Do better science, tell people about that, help them become compliant, but then follow up and make sure that they are disclosing hazards appropriately and consistently. And so, again, with a source of data to look at what workplaces are potentially posing the greatest risk to workers, what chemicals, maybe what classifications, are there sectors at risk, are there subpopulations of vulnerable workers that we should be focusing on? I think you can say there's a yes to all of those questions, but to be able to have data to drive that, we can focus our compliance enforcement efforts on those workplaces and bring those safety data sheets and product labels up to the bar that we want them to be at. So we've been doing a lot of engagement over the past several months, talking to many of our networks, and we're continuing to do that work here. We've spoken to the CEPA Industry Coordinating Committee, the WHMIS Current Issues Committee, which includes representatives from organized labor, industry, as well as provincial, territorial, occupational health and safety regulators, and the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. We've spoken to individual resource organizations, the Canadian Labour Congress. We presented at the CMP multi-stakeholder workshop, again, multi-stakeholder, industry, NGOs. We have been continuing to work with the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety all along, as well as our FPTOSH regulators, and we just completed a public consultation in the summer. So the next few slides just summarize some of the key messages, fairly high level, about what we heard during that consultation. We received 28 submissions. This breakdown shows you a bit of a map of where those came from. It's not exactly accurate because some submit as an association representing many parties and some submit individually, but we had all of the groups that you would expect to have a stake in this represented, which is the important part, I think. Generally, people are supportive of doing a better job at protecting workers. I think generally speaking, there was interest in exploring all of the elements that we've presented on here today, but with the understanding that we would continue to engage all of our stakeholders, and that we would follow those guiding principles, that we would not duplicate, that we would make use of what exists, the expertise, the committees, the structures that already exist to do this work. And there were some pointed considerations provided, sort of constructive criticism, suggesting that we needed to do a better job really identifying what the gap was we're trying to solve with these activities. I think maybe intuitive for many in this room, but it's something that we need to be really clear about explaining if we want everybody to be on board. Expanding the scope to focus on more prevention and informed substitution, looking potentially at vulnerable subpopulations, which I mentioned, as well as not taking away from what WHMIS and CMP currently offer by trying to integrate them and coordinate them. We had a lot of suggestions about opportunities for collaboration and leveraging that kind of expertise, and here's just some of them. Obviously, we've been working all along with our FPTOSH regulator colleagues. This is obviously the first thing that we did, and we've been continuing to do that work. But there are suggestions to engage workers directly, unions and employers, provincial, territorial departments of health, health professionals and occupational health and safety experts like yourselves, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, which I mentioned we're already doing, and research centres and associations, and this is just to list a few. So the next step is to continue to engage people to be able to refine this proposal and come up with something that's really concrete over the next while. We need to continue the discussions we're having with our colleagues at the FPT level, but also engage with other stakeholder populations. We're presenting at the February CMP Science Committee meeting. Another piece that is going to be sort of one of the next steps for us is to start to hammer out what are the data sharing needs that we have between us and our regulatory colleagues, and put into place the systems we'd need to do that, be it working with committee structures and things like that we already have, or potentially creating something that's expanded. Finally, here's just a pile of links for if you're interested in looking at any other the pieces of information we have, links about risk assessment, information sheets. There's the example I think that Sarah presented on the ketones group as well here. And that is the end of our presentation. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Oh, yeah, Kevin. I actually have a question I can ask on my way over to Kevin.
Nice.
I'm cheating. I'm butting in front. Actually, my question, I guess, is just how certain is this, or how viable is it? And I mean, you use the language proposal, opportunity, or whatever. So we, from the provincial realm, don't understand, I guess, or what are all the steps in the federal government, and because it would seem to me there'd be a whole scale up. It's a scope and scale kind of initiative, which we find very exciting. So I should have said, very exciting. Congratulations. Thanks a lot. We're all behind you. Just wondering what's the viability.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer that will make you happy. It's all still, it's uncertain. We're working through it. Some things certainly would be easier to do in the short term than others, like setting up, mechanisms to share information better. Like that is something I think we could do sooner. That's not as long term, but yeah. Sorry, I can't say for sure what timelines are.
Hi there, my name is Kevin Hedges, and on behalf of OCCOW, I spent some time preparing a submission against the chemical management plan, so this is something that's quite interesting for me. There's a lot of occupational hygienists in this room as well, so this really goes to our heart in a way as well. So I guess there's two comments and there's two questions. The first comment is, I remember going into a workplace some time ago and gathering lots of material safety data sheets, and looking at them, and I couldn't believe that many of them didn't have either risk phrases or hazard codes in them. That was just one comment. The other comment is, I gave a presentation earlier on talking about the number of occupational exposure limits compared to the number of chemical substances out there. And, if there's such a focus on an occupational exposure limit an occupational exposure limits compared to the number of chemical substances, is what I meant to say. There's such a focus on occupational exposure limit development. What about all the chemical substances that don't have an occupational exposure limit, which is huge, really? And so the question is, I'm just wondering about the overarching framework for both chemical risk assessment and chemical risk management. And, has there been any thought to aligning what's happening here with the different risk assessment processes under REACH, for example, like the Tier 1 risk assessment approach? That's the first question. And that's it, sorry, just one question. The alignment with REACH. Oh, no, and sorry, the second question was, how much occupational hygiene, industrial hygiene input is in there into this process, Are there toxicologists that make up the bulk of the science committee, or do occupational hygienists have a say in what's going on as well?
So currently, with the CMP Science Committee, Kirsten mentioned that the next meeting in February, the topic is going to be occupational exposure. The way it's structured is there are core members on the committee. I can't remember how long a term is. I don't know that any of them are occupational hygienists, but there is someone from the European Chemicals Agency on there, so who would have experience in both like an occupational exposure assessment and general population. And the thing with the science committee is that you get to, like depending on the topic, you bring in the experts in that field, so that in the case of occupational exposure, we'll be able to bring in, I don't know, 2 or 3 experts in the occupational exposure field to weigh in on that. And I'm hoping through that meeting too, we'll get a better sense of sort of international lessons learned. There are members from the U.S. there, like I said, ECHA. And so I think that will inform any potential alignment or best practices that we would want to look to.
And I guess just to sort of like say something else there. It does really go to the core of what we try to do. And, you were saying that at the moment, occupational hygienists, there's really no makeup. And I think it's really, really important that, occupational industrial hygiene expertise is provided to the process.
Certainly moving forward. I mean, I guess we haven't had that need in the way that we've been operating, but yeah.
Hi, thank you. So I have a question that pretty much echoes your question, but from a slightly different perspective. So it was also about REACH, and I think under REACH, certainly for existing chemicals, and I think probably also for new chemicals, nanoparticulate or nanoformulations are excluded from assessment. And I was wondering what you were doing on the Canadian side on that, because one thing we know about them is that they have higher health effects. Mm-hmm. And in talking about health effects, a question from the other perspective, that the reason that you're interested in these at all is because of the potential health effects, not so much about the exposure. You wouldn't be interested in the exposure if it didn't cause health effects. So are the specialist occupational physicians involved?
Just from the WHMIS side of things, they're captured under WHMIS theoretically. I think we don't have a defined policy at this point about how you treat them, but it's acknowledged that the risks aren't the same as, say, the molecular form of the same chemical, and that those should be disclosed differently, that you ought to have a separate SDS for aluminum oxide nanoparticles than aluminum oxide molecular format. But they are captured, and it's just a question of classifying them and disclosing those hazards.
Yeah, and I think I'd need to go back and double check on the risk assessment side. I know there is a group that does the nanoparticles. It's not in my group, and I think they're more at the stage of going through a prioritization process and assessments. But I'll follow up on that. That's a good point.
He's asking if there are any occupational physicians involved in the process or committees.
I don't know. I don't think, not yet that I know, but if you have suggestions, let me know. I was hoping to be here.
There's lots of suggestions.
At breaks and lunch to talk to people.
I'm on my way to Gloria, but I just want to also ask a question while I head there. And really, it's to highlight this one bullet on Kirsten's slide about the next step in implementing the strategy, which really aligns with what we've been talking about all day, to define data sharing needs with the regulators all over the country, and put in a process in place to share data. So is there funding for that going on? Because that's what we've been talking about all day.
Well, I guess sort of why we're here. I mean, the chemicals management plan is being reimagined, so we're trying to figure out how we spend the money that we receive from the chemicals management plan to best protect Canadians. And this proposal is considered a key gap that we could fill this way. So it's uncertain at this point, but we really hope so.
Yeah. So this is a good presentation, and as a toxicologist, I definitely have a great interest in it. But the questions that I have, and I wonder if they have been addressed, is right now we are set with our provincial legislation. For example, in Ontario, most workers are covered under the provincial legislation, and we have our own processes. So is it feasible, really, to integrate it at a national level, or how long would it take? I can see more the WHMIS side, perhaps. We can do things to assess its effectiveness nationally and provincially working together, but when it gets to the side of occupational exposure limits and how we develop and implement them, they're quite different in the different provinces. So I don't know if you have addressed these questions.
Yeah, I think there's still lots more discussion to happen on that. Like we certainly hear there, like on one hand, that there's a desire for harmonization of occupational exposure limits, but like you point out, every province sort of, has their own legislation. So, I mean, following the drinking water quality guideline model that we're thinking is, we would come out with something that can be used as a source of information as they like, and that's sort of as far as we could take it. But yeah, we need more discussion on that for sure. And I think it's a lot about cooperation, like collaboration and communication. Like if we did a risk assessment and just having mechanisms in place to share the results of that risk assessment so that, everybody involved knows that those risks are there in case they didn't know already. Yeah.
Part of hopefully why we're here today and the Occupational Disease Action Plan and why you came and spoke to us is that your role, everyone online, everyone in the room, is to start breaking down these boundaries and barriers instead of talking about them being in our way. So again, I want to thank you so much for being here, and we're going to call on Dr. Leon Genisov.